Okay, so before we get started today on looking at a causal argument paper and an effect argument paper, let's go ahead and talk about the project itself. And the student here today wants to know about Project 3, am I correct? Okay, so yes, Project 3. Project is about writing a paper arguing for a cause or effect on a particular phenomenon, trend, political movement, reasons behind why something happens, essentially, would be the causal argument. The effect would be the effect of policy, the effect of culture, the effect of, for instance, microaggressions. So there's a lot you can do here in terms of selecting a topic. It doesn't have to be tied to projects 1 or 2. And tomorrow morning, you will see the prompt itself. Is that enough clarity? Okay, all right. And I'll be talking more next week on the final project, though I do want to share that it is a creative project. You will be remixing one of your already completed projects into a multimedia digital video essay, podcast, sway page, presentation, all sorts of things are open to you, including a comic strip, if you're an artist, even exploring further ways to develop it. And so we're essentially keeping the genre that you wrote one of your prior projects papers for, but you're switching up the medium, which changes a lot of the ways that you go about meeting those basic features. And you'll see student examples, you'll see professional examples starting tomorrow, and it's really fun. And I look forward to seeing what you have to share with us, and also meeting with you individually if you'd like to get my feedback on your thoughts in the process, okay? All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our causal argument. And as I've done throughout, I do look to the New York Times opinion pages because they post so many opinions. And so it helps me to identify strong pieces that I can share with you. And wait, let me see 1 second. What's happening? So I'm going to open it again. Just want to see why my highlighting and other work didn't save. So quick sec, I'm going to share this. I'm going to see if I can highlight some notes. Is that right? Okay. So we're going to start. It looks like it didn't save my front page, but that's okay. I can talk you through it. So when we think about a argument, or this is an effects argument, sorry. Oh, an effects argument. We're going to start with that because that's what I have sharing. When we look at an effects argument or a causal argument, we want to look first at how the subject is presented. And as with any essay or paper, right, the title is the first way that you begin to present your subject. So for this particular effect, the title is Why the Wealthy Fear Pandemics. And if you could imagine this being an academic paper, what you would see is let me look at the markup toolbar. You would see, the colon, would be the coronavirus, like other plagues before it, could shift the balance between rich and poor, right? So that subheadline is actually part of the thesis statement, right? And so we're beginning to present the subject, and what happens next is an excellent opener. So many of you often hear from your teachers, faculty members, anybody you're writing a paper for, that you should always try for a really specific start to your paper, something that omits what I call the fluff. And the fluff would be something like, plagues have always happened in the world, right? And have impacted those that that live during the time of the plague itself, something like that. Or in this day and age. Those are all fluff ways to start a paper, and aren't as effective as using a really vivid and descriptive scene, because a well-presented subject is one in which you have clear, detailed, vivid introduction that helps to set the scene. And so here it is in the fall of 1347. So we see the scope already, right? Rat fleas carrying bubonic plague entered Italy on a few ships from the Black Sea. Over the next 4 years, a pandemic tore through Europe and the Middle East. Panic spread as the lymph nodes in victims' armpits and groins swelled into buboes. Black blisters covered their body. Fevers soared and organs failed. Perhaps a third of Europe's, right? So this is an overview, historical overview of the bubonic plague, and then it's followed up with this next, if we transition from giving us the big picture, this writer then drills into Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron and an eyewitness account, right? And again here, according to Agnolo di Tora of Siena, so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Okay, so just giving the impact, the scope of these pandemic plagues. And then again, a really excellent transition, and yet this was the beginning. So it's not like in these 4 years it was over, right? And I want to pause real quick to go back up to the Walter Scheidel, and he's a professor of classics and history at Stanford University, right? So he is somebody that we should view as a credible source. His authority helps him to provide a history of the bubonic plague without having to cite it, because that's what he does. He writes these books about it, okay? So that's why he doesn't cite. If you were to offer this kind of background, you would need to cite probably Scheidel, if this was the same, if this was your work of composition, okay? And then there are quotes when he's quoting from Decameron. It's a work of classic literature, and then of this eyewitness account as well, quoting from it, right? And the historian quoting from the historian. So this is all still a well-presented subject. And here we have the wealthy found some of these changes alarming, right? And if we look at why the wealthy fear pandemics, we can start to see how the title begins to shape the framing of the effect, right? The wealthy found some of these changes alarming. Basically, to recap, because the workers weren't willing to work at the measly wages that they previously were offered. And so even with attempts to pay them more, the workers had a lot of power, and it the aristocracy, and in England at this time and elsewhere as the plague spread, because without the lands upon which these landowners had enterprises failed, right? And so as we move on, we can move on to here. As a result of this shift in the balance between labor and capital, right? This is an effect, thanks to painstaking research by economic historians, that real incomes of unskilled workers doubled across much of Europe, right? According to tax records, they have survived. And even you go on. And then we transition to the thesis. But these outcomes were not a given. For centuries and indeed millenniums, great plagues and other severe shocks have shaped political preferences and decision-making by those in charge. This is where we want to look at the effects, right? The policy choices that result determine whether inequality rises or falls in response to such calamities, right? That's the effects of the plague. And history teaches us that these choices can change societies in very different ways. All right, so that's the thesis. There is this, what's the cause? Well, the cause is these plagues, or are these plagues, and the effect is a shift in how societies function. All right, so that's presenting the subject in a really detailed, descriptive, engaging, clear way. Now, in purple is our clear logical organization. And what I want to highlight about this is that Scheidel uses geography to organize the analysis, a well-presented, a well-supported analysis of the effect, right? And geography permits us to visualize where in the world he's going, to essentially showcase it's not just a one-off, this thesis, that these plagues have impacted shifts, but also it's everywhere, right? So looking across at the historical record across Europe, that's where we begin, right? During the Great Rising of England's peasants. Then we transition elsewhere, however, repression carried the day, okay? And here we're seeing the plague remains the cause, but the effects vary, okay? So in England, workers could hold out for better wages, and landlords and employers broke ranks with each other to compete for scarce labor. So this was good workers. Elsewhere, however, repression carried the day, right? In Eastern Europe, development fell behind, okay? So he's noting that the cause is all the same, but the effect differs. Farther south, we have Egypt, and here we have another poor result. The economy into a tailspin, right, as farmers revolted or abandoned their fields. And here we have, but more than not in this transition, repression failed. So here we have ways that repression, attempted to conquer, and in fact, ended up doing so to some degree, okay? And then we have an example, right, for how repression failed, and more examples in the Americas. So you see how geographically this is all organized, okay? And here is this section is actually the consideration of objections or alternate effects, right? Alternate effects. And here, let's take a look. In looking for illumination from the past on our current pandemic, right? Because the whole point, if you go back to the title, is why the welfare pandemics, the coronavirus could shift the balance between rich and poor, right? So he's just gone through all the ways, many of the ways in which wealthy individuals during a pandemic suffer. And no longer are as wealthy, and some lose it altogether, right? So in looking for illumination from the past on our current pandemic, we must be wary of superficial analogies, right? So here he's saying, okay, so I've just given you all of these analogies, given you historical incidents, dove deep, looked at, analyzed the results from these causes, effects, but he's pointing out the superficiality of these analogies because even in the worst case scenario, COVID will kill a far smaller share of the world's population than any of these disasters did. And it will touch the active workforce in the next generation even more lightly, right? So he's saying that he's basically ceding to an objection that, oh, well, these analogies, they're not quite perfectly aligned because yes, it's a cause is a plague and there's going to be some effect, but how do we know it's going to be this drastic an effect, right? And he even says, continuing, labor won't become scarce enough to drive up wages, nor will the value of state plummet. And we no longer rely on farmland or manual labor as the primary occupations. But he does offer, so this is a concession, right? This highlighted portion here is a concession. In his conclusion, he offers the rebuttal, yet, right? Yet the most important lesson of history endures. The impact of any pandemic goes well beyond lives lost and commerce curtailed. So he's saying it's not just about how many people will die, which he, highlights here, or what economic activities might be curtailed, right? He's saying, okay, he's conceded, and yet there's an important lesson that moves beyond these 2 points. Today, faces a fundamental choice between defending the status quo and embracing progressive change, right? So for this pandemic, the effect is that the current crisis here, right, could prompt redistributive reforms akin to those triggered by the Great Depression and World War II, unless entrenched proved too powerful to overcome. And by these entrenched interests, he basically means the inability for on the far right to see progressive change as positive, right? And so he's saying, well, no, the effect, it could be really great, just as with the Great Depression and World War II, we saw coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, we saw the unemployment insurance develop, we saw Social Security, we saw Medicare, right? All of these happen. These are social welfare systems that are in place, or safety nets, social safety nets. And so this idea of redistributive reforms, meaning, hey, we can take some of the wealth, tax them more, or expect them to pay more. In fact, I think that during the one of the wars, I believe, world wars, the most wealthy in America were taxed at like 90%. There was this idea that they needed to do more, and everybody was on board with it, including many of the wealthy. So this ends up being his final point, right? Is that this is an opportunity for redistributive reforms, which is another effect of a pandemic, beyond just lives lost and changes in the economic structures. And so he's proposing that this effect is possible, okay? So this is an argument driven by effect. Any questions on what we've just worked on here? If you can type no, that would be great, so I know to move on. Oh, okay, we do have a question. Okay, what's the question? Oh, okay, some confusion as to what I asked yes or no on. So we're set.